The mountains stood like the teeth of the world, jagged, white, and unforgiving. To the people of the ancient Mediterranean, the Alps were more than just a mountain range. They were a boundary line drawn by the gods themselves, a wall of ice and stone that separated the civilized world of Italy from the wild barbarian lands of the north. For an army to cross them in the height of summer was a feat of endurance. To cross them in late autumn, as the snows began to fall and the passes froze into sheets of ice, was considered madness. Yet, in the year 218 BC, a column of soldiers stretching for miles wound its way up those treacherous paths. They were a motley collection of Africans, Spaniards, and Gauls, speaking a dozen different tongues, united only by the will of one man. Among them lumbered beasts that had no business in the snow, 37 war elephants, their grey skin cracked by the cold, trumpeting their misery into the thin air. They were dying. Men slipped from the icy cliffs, falling silently into the abyss. Horses broke their legs on rocky scree and were butchered for meat. Local tribesmen rolled boulders down from the heights, crushing entire files of soldiers in an instant. Starvation stalked the campfires, and yet they kept moving. They moved because the man at their head, a 29-year-old general with eyes that burned with a singular terrifying purpose, refused to stop. He was bringing the war to Rome. He was bringing the apocalypse to the Eternal City. This is the story of Hannibal Barca, the crossing that broke the world. To understand why a man would march an army of nearly 50,000 men and 37 elephants over the roof of the world, we must first understand the hatred that fueled him. This was not a war of conquest in the traditional sense. It was a blood feud. Decades earlier, Rome and Carthage, the two great powers of the Western Mediterranean, had fought in the First Punic War. It was a grinding 23-year conflict fought largely at sea, a meat grinder that exhausted both nations. Carthage, a maritime empire of merchants and traders, eventually sued for peace. The terms Rome imposed were humiliating. Carthage lost Sicily, its jewel in the Mediterranean. It was forced to pay a crippling indemnity, a massive amount of silver that drained the treasury. And then, while Carthage was distracted fighting a mercenary rebellion at home, Rome seized Sardinia and Corsica, adding insult to injury. For Hamilcar Barca, the leading Carthaginian general, who had never truly been defeated in the field, this was a stain on his honor that could not be washed away. He looked at his young son, Hannibal, then only 9 years old. According to the historian Polybius, Hamilcar took the boy to a sacrificial altar. He made him place his small hand upon the bleeding victim and swear a sacred oath that it would never be a friend to Rome, that he would define his life by opposition to the city on the Tiber. Hannibal grew up in the army camps of Spain. After the loss of Sicily, the Carthaginians turned to the Iberian Peninsula to regain their wealth and power. It was a land rich in silver mines and fierce warriors. Hamilcar conquered vast swathes of it, forging a new empire to replace the one lost. When Hamilcar drowned during a campaign, command passed to his son-in-law, Hasdrubal the Fair, and when Hasdrubal was assassinated, the army claimed Hannibal as their commander. He was 26 years old. He possessed the charisma of Alexander the Great and the strategic mind of a chess grandmaster. He was fluent in Greek and Latin, well read in history and military theory. He slept on the ground with his men, ate the same rations, and was the first to enter battle and the last to leave. The soldiers adored him. They saw the fire of Hamilcar in him, and Hannibal knew that the time for the oath was approaching. The spark that lit the powder keg was the city of Saguntum. Located on the eastern coast of Spain, Saguntum was a Roman ally, though it lay south on the Ebro River, the agreed-upon boundary between Roman and Carthaginian spheres of influence. In 219 BC, Hannibal laid siege to the city. He claimed they were attacking Carthaginian allies. Rome claimed he was violating the treaty. The Saguntines called for help, but Rome dithered, sending envoys instead of legions. Hannibal ignored the envoys. Finally, the city fell. The population was enslaved, their wealth looted. Rome, its prestige on the line, sent a delegation to Carthage. The Roman envoy Fabius Maximus stood before the Carthaginian Senate. He held the folds of his toga in his hands. "I carry here peace and war," he declared. "Choose which you will have." The Carthaginian senators, emboldened by their new wealth and the strength of the Barcid Empire, replied, "Give us whichever you please." Fabius let the toga fall. "Then we give you war." The senators shouted back, "We accept it, and we'll fight it with the same spirit with which we accept it. The Second Punic War had begun, but while Rome prepared for a war in Spain and Africa, expecting a conventional conflict, Hannibal was already moving. He had no intention of fighting a defensive war. He knew that Rome's strength lay in its seemingly endless pool of manpower. As long as the Italian Confederacy held, Rome could lose army after army and still raise more. The only way to defeat Rome was to break that confederacy. He had to go to Italy. He had to show the Italian allies that Rome could be beaten, that they could be liberated. He gathered his army at New Carthage. It was a massive force, though historians debate the exact numbers. Polybius suggests that he started with nearly 90,000 infantry and 12,000 cavalry. He sent some to protect Spain, sent others to Africa to protect Carthage, and marched north with the rest. The journey from New Carthage to the Pyrenees was a campaign in itself. Hannibal had to subdue the tribes of northern Spain, ensuring his supply lines would remain open. This cost him men. He lost thousands to combat and desertion. By the time he crossed the Pyrenees and entered Gaul, his force was leaner, perhaps 50,000 infantry and 9,000 cavalry. He moved with speed, but also with caution. Gaul was a patchwork of Celtic tribes, warriors who prized individual glory in headhunting. Hannibal used his treasury to smooth the way. He met with chieftains, showered them with gold and silver, and assured them his quarrel was not with them. He was passing through to fight Rome. Many tribes let him pass, happy to take his money and see the dangerous army leave their lands. Others were not so accommodating. The first major obstacle was the Rhone River. It was late September. The river was wide, cold, and swollen. On the opposite bank, the Volcae, a powerful Gaelic confederation, had gathered in force. They had realized that an army of this size would strip their lands bare like locusts. They intended to stop Hannibal at the water's edge. They had purchased or stolen every boat on the river and lined the eastern bank, howling insults and brandishing their weapons. Hannibal knew that an amphibious assault against a prepared enemy was a recipe for disaster. He camped on the western bank and devised a plan. He sent a trusted lieutenant, Hanno, the son of Bomilcar, with a detachment of cavalry and light infantry. They moved north under the cover of night, riding 25 miles upstream to a location where the river was divided by an island, making it wider but shallower. They built hasty rafts from felled timber, inflating skins to float their shields and armor. In silence, they crossed the river. Once on the eastern bank, they rested for a day to let the men recover from the cold water in the march. Then, they moved south, creeping through the forest behind the Volcae camp. On the morning of the third day, Hanno signaled with a column of smoke. Hannibal, watching from the western bank, immediately ordered the crossing. He had commandeered small boats for the heavy infantry and built massive rafts for the horses. The larger vessels were positioned upstream to break the force of the current for the smaller boats downstream. As the Carthaginian flotilla pushed off, the Volcae rushed to the water's edge, beating their shields and screaming war songs, confident in their victory. They saw the Carthaginians struggling against the current, vulnerable. They did not see the doom behind them. Just as the first Carthaginian boats neared the shore, Hanno's cavalry burst from the tree line. They torched the Volcae camp, setting the tents ablaze. Smoke and screams filled the air. The Gauls turned, confused and terrified. In that moment of hesitation, Hannibal's infantry landed. They formed a shield wall and charged. Caught between the river and the fire, the Volcae broke. It was a rout. But the river crossing wasn't over. There was still the matter of the elephants. These animals were the tanks of the ancient world. Terrifying to behold, but skittish and terrified of deep water. They refused to step onto the rafts. Hannibal's engineers came up with an ingenious, if labor-intensive solution. They built massive earthen piers extended from the bank to the river, covering the wood with soil and grass to make it look like solid ground. They lashed these piers securely to the bank. At the end of the pier, they attached a large raft, also covered in earth. They led the elephants onto the pier, using female elephants to lead the males. Once the animals were on the raft, the ropes were cut. Boats towed the rafts across the river. Some elephants panicked as soon as the motion began. They stampeded, knocking them a house into the water. But terror eventually kept them huddled together in the center of the rafts. Others fell into the river, but finding their buoyancy, used their trunks as snorkels and swam to the other side. In the end, all the elephants made it across. Hannibal had crossed the Rhone, but he had lost precious time. Roman scouts had spotted his camp. Publius Cornelius Scipio, the Roman consul, had landed his army at Massilia, modern-day Marseille, intending to fight Hannibal in Spain. When he realized Hannibal was on the Rhone, he was stunned. He marched his legions north to intercept the Carthaginians, hoping to catch them disordered after the crossing. Hannibal had a choice. He he could turn and fight Scipio. He likely would have won. His army was larger and battle-hardened, but a battle would have cost him men, and more importantly, time. Winter was closing in. If he got bogged down in Gaul, the passes of the Alps would become impassable. He would be trapped north of the mountains while Rome raised more legions. So, he made the strategic decision to ignore Scipio. He turned north, moving away from the coast, heading for the confluence of the Rhone and the Isère rivers. He was racing this season. Scipio arrived at the Carthaginian camp 3 days later. He found nothing but cold ashes and empty earth. He realized instantly what Hannibal was planning. It was audacious. It was insanity. He was going for Italy. Scipio made a critical decision. He sent the bulk of his army under his brother Gnaeus to Spain to attack Hannibal's supply base. He himself returned to Italy to take command of the legions in the Po Valley. He knew that if Hannibal emerged from the Alps, he would need an army waiting for him. Meanwhile, Hannibal reached the territory of the Allobroges, a tribe located at the foothills of the Alps. He found the tribe in the midst of a civil war between two brothers fighting for chieftaincy. Hannibal, needing supplies and guides, intervened. He sided with the elder brother Brancus, and with the weight of the Carthaginian army behind him, Brancus easily defeated his rival. In gratitude, Brancus supplied the army with corn, winter clothing, vital for what was to come, and footwear. Most importantly, he provided guides to lead them to the first passes. For a few days, the army marched in relative safety, the Allobroges acting as a rear guard. But once they reached the mountains proper, the friendly guides turned back. Hannibal was on his own. The geography of Hannibal's crossing is one of the greatest mysteries of history. Historians have argued for centuries over the exact route. Was it the Col de la Traversette? The Col de Mont-Cenis? The Col de Clapier? We may never know for sure. What we do know is the experience of the ascent. It was October, in the lower valleys. The autumn harvest was in, but as they climbed, the trees thinned, the air grew sharp, and the green gave way to the grey of granite and the white of early snow. The mountain tribes here were not friendly. They were hill people, fierce and territorial. They saw this massive, slow-moving column laden with supplies as a gift. They gathered on the heights shadowing the army. On one side, a sheer rock face. On the other, a precipitous drop into a ravine. The column stretched out for miles, vulnerable. When the army entered a particularly narrow gorge, the tribesmen attacked. They didn't fight a pitched battle. They rolled massive boulders down the slopes. The rocks smashed into the pack animals, sending mules and horses screaming over the edge. Carts shattered, men were crushed. The noise was deafening. The roar of the rocks, the screams of the dying, the trumpeting of the elephants. The elephants, curiously, were the safest. The tribesmen had never seen such beasts and were terrified to approach them. Hannibal, commanding the rear guard, saw that the army was in danger of being cut in two. If the baggage train were lost, the army would starve. He had anticipated this. He had stationed the heavy infantry on a ridge overlooking the gorge. As the tribesmen swarmed down to loot the dead, Hannibal counterattacked. It was a brutal vertical fight. Men grappled on the edge of cliffs, but the discipline of the Carthaginians prevailed. They cleared the heights, but the cost was heavy. They had lost many animals and significant supplies. They continued to climb. They captured a mountain town, seizing cattle and grain, enough to feed the army for 3 days. But the higher they went, the worse it got. The tribes changed tactics. They approached Hannibal with olive branches, offering friendship and guides. Hannibal was suspicious, but they had little choice. He needed to know the way. He accepted their guides, but kept his army in a defensive marching order, with the baggage and elephants at the center and the heavy infantry on the outside. His suspicion was well founded. In a steep, narrow pass, the friendly guides turned on them. The tribesmen attacked from ambush, rolling rocks and raining javelins. They managed to cut the column, separating the vanguard from the rear guard. For one night, Hannibal was forced to camp on a bare rock, separated from his baggage and his cavalry, protecting the path while his men huddled against the cold. 9 days after beginning the ascent, the vanguard reached the summit. The attacks ceased. The tribesmen had given up. Or perhaps the terrain had become too hostile even for them. The army that gathered on the high plateau was a wreck. Men were suffering from altitude sickness, frostbite and exhaustion. Their clothes were tattered. Their shoes were worn through. They were surrounded by peaks of eternal ice. It was a landscape of utter desolation. The morale of the army was at its breaking point. They were Mediterranean men, used to sun and sea. Here, in this white hell, they felt abandoned by the gods. Mutiny was in the air. Hannibal called the men together. As Polybius records, he led them to a rocky promontory that rose above the clouds. When the mist thinned, the land below came into view. The broad plains of the Po Valley. Hannibal pointed downward. He reminded the army that the worst of their march was behind them. Beyond the mountains lay fertile country, supplies, and people already hostile to Rome. what remained would be settled in Italy itself. It was a moment of supreme leadership. He gave them hope when they had none. He rested the army for 2 days. They waited for stragglers to catch up. Amazingly, some of the pack animals that had fallen or scattered during the attacks stumbled into the camp, following the scent of the army. But the descent would prove more deadly than the ascent. The southern face of the Alps is much steeper than the northern, and while the ascent had been fought against men, the descent was fought against the elements. New snow had fallen on top of the old, frozen snow from the previous winter. This created a deadly trap. The fresh snow offered no grip. When the men and animals stepped on it, they punched through to the slick ice beneath. They slid uncontrollably. Polybius describes a scene of horror. Men sliding down the abyss, grasping at the bushes and roots. Horses laden with baggage, losing their footing and tumbling, knocking over the men in their path. The slope was so steep that once you started sliding, you didn't stop until you hit the bottom. And then they hit a dead end. The landslide had swept away the path. A 1,000-foot drop lay before them. The guides shook their heads. There was no way around. They were trapped. Hannibal tried to find a detour. He led the army onto a glacier, but the fresh snow was treacherous. The hooves of the animals broke through the crust, and they became stuck in the hard ice beneath, trapped like statues. It was hopeless. They had to go back to the landslide. They camped on the ridge. It was freezing. There was no fodder for the animals. The elephants were starving, licking the snow for moisture. Hannibal ordered the engineers to fix the path. This is one of the most famous moments of the crossing. The rock was too hard to chip away with pickaxes, so the Carthaginians used science. They felled a few stunted trees in the area and built a massive fire on top of the rock blocking the path. They kept the fire burning until the rock was glowing red hot. Then they took their rations of sour wine, vinegar, and poured it onto the superheated stone. The thermal shock shattered the rock. The vinegar seeped into the cracks, expanding and breaking the stone apart. It was a technique known in ancient mining, but to apply it here, on the side of a mountain in a blizzard, was a feat of desperate ingenuity. Once the rock was cracked, the men attacked it with iron tools. They worked in shifts, day and night, driven by the fear of starvation. In one day, they cleared a path wide enough for the horses and mules. They sent them down to the pasture below. It took another 3 days to widen the path enough for the elephants. By the time the great beasts were led down, they were skeletal, barely able to stand. Finally, 15 days after entering the mountains, Hannibal's army stumbled onto the plains of the Po Valley. The cost had been astronomical. Polybius states that Hannibal arrived with 12,000 African infantry, 8,000 Spanish infantry, and 6,000 cavalry. He had lost nearly half his army in the crossing. They looked more like beasts than men. Their skin was frostbitten, their bodies emaciated, their clothes hanging in rags. They were in no condition to fight, but they were in Italy. He raided the local town of Carini, modern Turin, massacring the inhabitants to send a message to the other local tribes: join me or suffer. The Gauls of the Po Valley, long enemies of Rome, began to waver. They wanted to see if this Carthaginian could actually fight. They didn't have to wait long. Publius Scipio had moved fast. He had taken command of the Roman legions in northern Italy and marched to intercept Hannibal at the Ticinus River. The Battle of Ticinus was a skirmish, a clash of cavalry, but it was decisive. Scipio led his light infantry and heavy cavalry against Hannibal. He expected the Carthaginians to be weak. He was wrong. Hannibal's Numidian cavalry, despite their exhaustion, were masters of the horse. They outflanked the Romans, swarming around the sides while the heavy Spanish cavalry charged the center. The Roman light infantry threw one volley of javelins and fled. The cavalry fight was brutal, but the Romans were surrounded. Scipio himself was severely wounded. He was surrounded by the enemy, about to be killed, when his 18-year-old son, the future Scipio Africanus, charged into the fray to save his father. The Romans retreated. It was a small victory, but the psychological impact was huge. The Romans had been beaten on Italian soil. The Gauls of the Po saw this and made their choice. They flocked to Hannibal, bringing food, supplies, and thousands of fresh warriors. Hannibal's army swelled. He was no longer an invader. He was the leader of a rebellion. The Romans were panicked. They recalled the second consul, Tiberius Sempronius Longus, from Sicily. He marched his army north, joining Scipio near the Trebia River. The Romans now had over 40,000 men. Sempronius, ambitious and arrogant, was in command while Scipio recovered from his wounds. He wanted a victory before his term as consul ended. Hannibal knew his enemy. He knew Sempronius was rash. It was December, the winter solstice. The weather was freezing. with sleet and snow mixed with rain. The Trebia River was swollen and icy. Hannibal set a trap. He noticed a dry stream bed, overgrown with briars, located between the two camps. It was perfect for an ambush. He ordered his brother Mago to take 1,000 picked infantry and 1,000 cavalry and hide there during the night. The next morning, Hannibal sent his Numidian cavalry across the river to harass the Roman camp. They rode up to the gates, throwing javelins and shouting insults. Sempronius took the bait. He ordered his entire army to deploy. Let us crush them before breakfast, he might have thought. The Romans marched out without eating. They were cold and hungry. To get the Carthaginians, they had to wade through the Trebia River. The water was chest high and freezing. By the time the 40,000 Romans climbed up the far bank, they were soaked to the bone. Their limbs were numb. They could barely grip their swords. Hannibal's men, on the other hand, had eaten a hot breakfast by their fires. They had rubbed their bodies with oil to insulate against the cold. They were rested. Hannibal drew up his line. He placed his elephants on the wings. As the shivering Romans advanced, the Carthaginians held firm. The Roman heavy infantry fought bravely, their discipline pushing back the Carthaginian center. But on the wings, the Roman cavalry, outnumbered and demoralized by the elephants, collapsed. And then, Mago sprang the trap. As the Romans were fully engaged, Mago's 2,000 men burst from the stream bed and smashed into the rear of the Roman line. Panic set in. Surrounded, freezing, and attacked from all sides, the Roman army disintegrated. The elephants trampled the flanks. The Numidians cut down the fleeing. Thousands were pushed into the river to drown. It was a massacre. Only a central block of 10,000 legionnaires managed to cut their way through and escape to the nearby city of Placentia. The disaster at Trebia sent shockwaves through Rome. The impossible had happened. A foreign army had crossed the impassable barrier of the Alps in the winter. They had survived starvation, landslides, and tribal attacks. And now, they had destroyed a Roman consular army on Italian soil. Hannibal had achieved the unthinkable. He had brought the war to Rome. His crossing of the Alps was more than just a military maneuver. It was a psychological blow from which Rome would struggle to recover for years. It demonstrated a level of strategic audacity that redefined warfare. The war would drag on for another 16 years. There would be greater battles, Lake Trasimene, the horror of Cannae, but the crossing of the Alps remains the defining image of the conflict. It is the image of man against nature, of will against the impossible. When we look back at history, we often see dates and maps, but close your eyes and imagine the sound of the wind of the high passes. Imagine the trumpeting of an elephant in the snow. Imagine the look of a Roman sentry's face when he saw, descending from the clouds, the army that should have died. Hannibal ultimately lost the war. Carthage would burn, but in the Alps, he achieved immortality. He showed the world that there are no walls high enough to keep out a man of sufficient will. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of antiquity's most legendary campaigns, be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel.